The doctor's words seemed to split the air in half. He needs a kidney as soon as possible. The sterile light of the hospital room flickered over Hope's face, draining what little color was left. She sat frozen, her hands pressed together so tightly that her knuckles turned white, as though sheer willpower might hold Liam's life in place. The monitors behind her pulsed in steady rhythm, the only sound that dared to exist in the heavy silence. Liam lay motionless on the bed, pale as candle wax, each breath labored and mechanical. The shock of it all numbed her. One minute, he was joking about wedding rehearsal plans. The next, his body had simply given up. The tests had confirmed it. His kidneys were failing rapidly. Hope felt something cold and absolute settle inside her chest, a fear that logic could not soothe. They began the family testing immediately. Hope clung to the belief that science would find a solution, that somewhere in their bloodlines was the miracle match that would save him. Each vial of blood drawn from family members felt like a piece of hope being poured into the system, a small prayer disguised as data. But as the hours stretched and the results trickled in, the answers grew heavier. Incompatible, partial match. Too risky, no viable donors. The medical jargon blurred into static. The truth, however cruelly simple, was this: no one close to Liam could save him. The only thing more unbearable than losing someone is knowing you have nothing left to give when their time runs out. Bill Spencer, who had built his entire empire on control, could not accept helplessness. He paced the hospital corridor like a storm confined to glass, fists clenched, jaw locked. The thought that his son's life was slipping away while he stood powerless turned every breath into a curse. But when the doctor mentioned the phrase, "no available donors," Bill's mind twisted the words into something darker. He thought of the one name that had haunted his family for months: Grace, the woman whose negligence had indirectly caused Liam's kidneys to fail. She was the ghost behind the tragedy, the reminder that human error could be as fatal as a loaded gun. And in that moment, Bill's grief morphed into rage. Two words repeated in his mind like a drumbeat: Grace must pay. While Hope clung to Liam's bedside, refusing to leave, Bill disappeared into the night with fury as his compass. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, but Katie suspected. She'd seen that look in his eyes before, the same one that had preceded every ruthless takeover, every moral compromise dressed in justification. She tried calling him, but he didn't answer. Bill was already on his way to confront Grace. In his mind, the equations were simple. Liam was dying, and the woman responsible was out there, breathing free air, hiding behind apologies and the privilege of surviving her own mistakes. Meanwhile, in another wing of the hospital, a young intern was sorting through the transplant compatibility database when something strange caught his attention. The system's algorithm flagged an almost perfect tissue match for Liam, a rare occurrence, so precise it made the intern pause. The donor, however, wasn't available in the conventional sense. The record belonged to a woman named Hannah Pearson, a patient who had been in a persistent vegetative state for nearly 3 years after a car accident. Her body was alive, but her mind was gone, suspended in endless twilight. Her family had never agreed to organ donation. They couldn't bear to sign the papers that would end her body's mechanical survival. For years, doctors had gently suggested it might be time to let go, but the family always refused, clinging to the hope of impossible recovery. When the attending physician brought the case to Hope, she was too stunned to speak. It felt cruel, almost immoral, to pin her fiancé's life on the heartbreak of strangers. But the alternative was unthinkable. Time was running out. If no match came through within 48 hours, Liam's organs would begin to shut down entirely. Hope sat in the hospital chapel that night, staring at the flickering candles, trying to summon the courage to do something she never thought she could: plead for someone else's death in order to preserve the life of the man she loved. The prayer she whispered wasn't for forgiveness. It was for strength to live with whatever decision she had to make next. Bill, in the meantime, had found Grace. He confronted her outside her clinic, his voice like broken glass. The moment she saw him, she froze, recognizing the hatred in his eyes. He accused her of arrogance, of malpractice disguised as compassion, of destroying his son's future. Grace didn't argue. She'd been living inside her own punishment long before Bill arrived. But his words cut deeper than she expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. "You took everything from him," he growled, "and now I'm going to take everything from you." The threat wasn't empty. Within days, Bill set his machinery in motion: lawyers, investigators, private auditors. He ordered them to uncover every mistake Grace had ever made, every questionable prescription, every patient who might have felt neglected. He wanted her professional life to crumble, her name to be synonymous with disgrace. In his mind, vengeance wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoration. If he couldn't save Liam through medicine, he would at least balance the moral scales by destroying the person who caused his pain. But vengeance has a strange way of hollowing its keeper. As Bill orchestrated lawsuits and public pressure campaigns, Hope was walking into a different kind of battle, a quiet one fought with words, not rage. She drove for hours to meet Hannah Pearson's family, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. The Pearsons lived on a quiet street lined with maple trees, their home immaculate but filled with the kind of stillness that spoke of grief too deep to air out. When they opened the door, Hope could barely find her voice. She told them about Liam, about his condition, about how Hannah's body held the only hope left. Her words stumbled, tangled between gratitude and guilt. "I know what I'm asking sounds unbearable," she said softly, "but you have the power to give life where death has already taken so much." The family listened in silence. The mother's eyes were hollow. The father's hands trembled as he rubbed the edge of a photo frame. They weren't cruel people. They were simply exhausted by years of mourning someone who was neither alive nor dead. The idea of signing the papers felt like betrayal, like admitting their daughter was truly gone. Hope understood that pain. Every plea she made felt like a knife twisting in her own conscience. It wasn't just about saving Liam anymore. It was about confronting the cruel arithmetic of life and death, where one existence could only continue by ending another. The following day, while Bill's vendetta reached fever pitch, his lawyers filing motions, his media team leaking whispers about medical negligence, the Pearsons made their decision. They arrived at the hospital quietly, holding hands. When they signed the donation authorization, the mother whispered, she wanted to help people. Maybe this is her way of still doing that. Hope broke down completely, crying not just from relief, but from shame. She thanked them through tears, though she knew no amount of gratitude could ever equal their loss. The transplant was scheduled within hours. The surgical team moved swiftly, the tension in the air electric. Hope stayed in the waiting room, her body numb, her thoughts drifting between prayer and disbelief. She didn't notice when Bill arrived, pacing the hall like a caged shadow. He had just come from another meeting with his lawyers, where he'd learned that his crusade against Grace had turned messy. One of his investigators had leaked confidential medical records, triggering a countersuit that could destroy not just Grace, but his own company's reputation. Still, he didn't care, at least not until he saw Hope. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the surgery doors, her expression a quiet storm of fear and faith. For the first time in weeks, Bill felt something break. All his fury, all his threats, all his justifications suddenly seemed absurd beside the stillness of that waiting room. He realized, with crushing clarity, that none of it had ever been about justice. It had been about control, his futile attempt to wrestle meaning from suffering. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had signed contracts to ruin a woman's life, and he wondered if they had ever once been capable of saving anything. Hours later, when the surgeon emerged, his expression was calm. The transplant was successful, he said. Hope didn't respond at first. Her brain couldn't process words anymore. She looked past him toward the recovery room, where Liam's body now carried a stranger's life within it. Bill followed her gaze, the weight of everything settling on him. He wanted to feel triumph, but all he felt was emptiness. Grace was facing public humiliation, possibly prison. The Pearsons were leaving the hospital with the silence of people who had given too much. And yet, the man he had nearly lost was alive, not because of power or vengeance, but because of mercy. In the days that followed, Hope spent her time in the recovery ward, holding Liam's hand, whispering to him even as he drifted in and out of sedation. When he finally opened his eyes, she told him everything, not the rage or the lawsuits, but the generosity that had saved him. "A family you'll never meet chose to let go," she said. "That's why you're still here." Liam's lips parted in a fragile smile. He couldn't speak yet, but the tears in his eyes said enough. Bill didn't go into the room. He stood outside, staring through the glass, watching his son breathe. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he murmured, "It wasn't me who saved him." The admission was heavy, but it was also freeing. He had built his life believing strength came from dominance, but now he saw how powerless vengeance truly was. Grace, meanwhile, faced the storm he had unleashed. The lawsuits multiplied. Her license was suspended pending review. Her face appeared on news broadcasts, her career dissected like a crime scene. Yet, when she learned Liam had survived, she wept, not from fear, but from relief. She didn't fight back publicly. She didn't try to defend herself. She simply accepted the ruin as part of her penance. In private, she wrote to Hope, a letter the young woman would read weeks later. "I can't undo what I've done, but I hope he lives the life I couldn't protect." Months passed. Liam grew stronger, though traces of fragility lingered like ghosts. Hope carried the memory of Hannah Pearson's family in her heart, visiting them once, standing quietly before a gravestone engraved with words that made her cry. She gave so others might live. Bill never spoke to Grace again. The lawsuit dissolved after a quiet settlement, one that cost him more than money. It cost him the last fragments of righteousness he'd clung to. In the end, the story didn't close with victory or redemption, but with quiet reckoning. Hope learned that love, when tested by mortality, becomes something raw and selfless, stripped of illusion. Bill learned that vengeance is a hollow god, feeding on pain but never granting peace. And Grace, cast into exile by her own mistakes, found in loss a form of truth that no courtroom could define. One night, as the sun sank behind the hills and the hospital windows caught the last golden light, Bill stood alone outside the recovery ward. Liam was asleep inside, his chest rising with borrowed breath. Hope sat beside him, her head resting on the bed, eyes closed in exhaustion. Bill pressed his hand against the glass, a quiet gesture of surrender. For the first time in his life, he realized that all his power, his money, his rage, his ambition, had never truly saved anyone. What saved his son was something he couldn't control: the grace of strangers, the mercy of those who chose compassion over revenge. And as he turned to leave, the corridor empty and still behind him, he whispered the words he once used as a curse but now understood as truth. "Grace paid the price," he said softly, "but mercy gave him life." Then he walked into the dimness, carrying with him the uneasy peace of a man who had finally learned that salvation was never his to command. It was his to recognize when it came, quiet and undeserved, like forgiveness itself. The news hit like a blade through the air. Liam would die without a transplant. The doctor's tone was professional, but the words cut with surgical precision. "His kidneys are failing. We need a compatible donor immediately." Hope's world tilted, her breath catching as though someone had drawn the oxygen out of the room. Machines beeped in an indifferent rhythm beside Liam's bed, marking the seconds slipping away from the man she loved. She wanted to speak, to plead, to promise him something she could not give, but her voice broke under the weight of silence. And somewhere behind that silence, the faint sound of paper shuffling began, the hospital's review of Liam's medical history, the reopening of old files that should have stayed buried. It was late one night when Hope overheard it. A nurse, whispering to another in the corridor outside the ICU. Grace had the results months ago, an abnormal toxicity reading. She dismissed it, said it was probably a glitch. Hope froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. The words made no sense at first. Grace? The same Grace who had treated Liam during his supposed brain tumor scare a year earlier? That nightmare had ended in relief, or so they'd believed, when the scans came back clean. But now, piece by piece, the puzzle began to twist into something monstrous. Grace's prescription, an experimental medication she insisted was safe, hadn't been a placebo after all. It was counterfeit, an unregulated sample she'd kept hidden to avoid scrutiny. The glitch in Liam's test results had been the first sign of the drug's toxicity, the silent decay that had been eating away at his kidneys ever since. Hope felt her stomach twist. She wanted to dismiss it, to believe there was some misunderstanding, but the truth was already leaking through the hospital's corridors like poison. When the board accessed Liam's full record, they discovered discrepancies, altered numbers, overwritten data entries, even deleted reports. Grace had tampered with his file, likely in panic, fearing that a mistake during her clinical trial oversight would end her career. But the cost of that deception had been devastating. Liam's kidneys were never destroyed by illness. They were murdered by negligence. When Bill Spencer heard the truth, the rage that tore through him was almost unearthly. His voice echoed down the hospital hall like thunder. She knew. She knew, and she did nothing. There were few men in Los Angeles who could match Bill's ferocity when cornered, and now he was cornered by grief itself. He demanded immediate suspension for Grace, storming into the hospital boardroom as though he owned it. He threatened lawsuits, investigations, ruin. His words weren't just fury, they were prophecy. "You'll never touch another patient again," he snarled, his jaw tight with barely contained violence. But behind the steel of his voice was something more fragile. Desperation. Because beneath all the hatred, Bill was terrified of losing Liam, terrified of being powerless, terrified that vengeance might be the only way left to feel in control. Grace, meanwhile, had become a ghost in her own workplace. Her colleagues avoided her eyes. She barely ate. The whispers followed her everywhere. Rumors of misconduct, of forged results, of playing God with patients' lives. Yet what none of them knew was that Grace's story had begun long before Liam's tragedy. Years ago, as a young resident, she had saved a dying child by convincing the family to agree to an organ transplant. The decision had haunted her, not because it was wrong, but because she had tasted the dangerous power of persuasion, the way a doctor's words could tilt the axis of life and death. That child survived, grew up, and eventually returned to the same hospital as a volunteer. His name was Michael. He was 24 now, bright-eyed, full of idealism, and as fate would have it, he had the same rare blood type as Liam. When Grace learned this, her heart broke anew. She had the answer to Hope's prayers locked inside her own conscience. If she came forward, she could connect Michael to the transplant registry and move Liam to the top of the emergency list. But doing so would require full transparency, revealing the falsified data, the malpractice, the cover-up. She would lose her license, her reputation, everything she had ever worked for. Yet if she remained silent, Liam would die. The irony cut deeper with every passing hour. To atone for one life lost, she would have to destroy her own. Bill's investigation pressed harder. He discovered Grace's medical condition, a mild genetic renal disorder that made her own kidneys imperfect but still viable under strict medical control. When he read the compatibility chart and saw that she was a near match for Liam, something twisted inside him. His grief metastasized into obsession. The thought took root. If she caused the damage, she should pay the price with her own body. It began as an intrusive thought, but it grew, whispering promises of retribution. He imagined walking into her office, cornering her, demanding her consent for a donation. She owes him that much, he told himself. And when logic fought back, whispering that no one could be forced into such a thing, he buried it beneath the roar of paternal anguish. Hope, sensing his volatility, tried to stop him. "You're crossing a line," she told him. But Bill's eyes, usually so sharp, were glassy with desperation. "Lines don't matter when it's your child dying," he answered. The words were ice, and Hope realized she was losing him to something darker than grief. At the same time, Grace's conscience fractured under the weight of her secrets. She found herself staring at Liam's name on the hospital monitors, remembering the way he used to joke with her during treatments, the trust in his voice when he said, "You're the only one who can help me." Now, she felt that trust clawing at her ribs like a living thing. Her hands shook when she held a pen. Every corridor in the hospital seemed to whisper his name. She could no longer tell whether the pounding in her chest was fear or guilt. The confrontation came suddenly. Hope, searching for answers after overhearing more from the staff, cornered Grace outside the operating theater. The two women stood under the harsh fluorescent light, the air thick with antiseptic and accusation. Hope's voice trembled, but her words were sharp as glass. "You can help him," she said. "You know something, you've known it all along. Why won't you act?" Grace tried to deny it, to hide behind protocol, but the truth leaked through her trembling voice. Hope stepped closer, her composure unraveling. "You made him sick, and now you have a chance to save him. What kind of person hesitates?" Grace flinched as though struck. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Because if I do this, I lose everything." Hope stared at her in disbelief. "Everything," she repeated softly. "You think your career is everything? Try watching the man you love fade a little more every minute." The words hit like a physical blow. Grace turned away, gripping the wall to keep from collapsing. She wanted to say that she understood, that she wasn't a monster, but guilt had stripped her of language. Hope's next words broke her completely. "You can still be the doctor he believed in. Or you can be the reason he never wakes up." In that moment, Grace's resistance shattered. She confessed everything, every falsified report, every error, every moment of cowardice. She gave the board full access to her encrypted files, revealing the paper trail that led directly to her mistake. Most importantly, she submitted the compatibility data for Michael, ensuring Liam's immediate placement on the emergency donor list. The decisions sealed her fate. She knew that by morning, she would be summoned before the Medical Ethics Board, her name stripped from the register, her career dissolved in scandal. But for the first time in months, her conscience was quiet. Bill, upon learning of her confession, saw his plans for vengeance collapse into dust. The board suspended Grace on the spot, pending formal inquiry. Reporters swarmed outside the hospital. Legal teams prepared lawsuits. But all of it felt distant to Bill now, drowned out by the sound of his son's heart monitor, steady and fragile. He stood outside Liam's room, staring through the glass, haunted by the echo of his own thoughts. He had wanted to destroy a woman, to make her body an offering to his grief, and now, realizing how close he'd come to crossing that line, he felt hollow. What kind of father contemplates such darkness? What kind of man mistakes revenge for salvation? The next morning, the transplant team rushed Liam into surgery. A compatible donor, anonymous to the public, had been cleared within hours, thanks to Grace's disclosure. Hope clutched Bill's hand in the waiting room, though neither spoke. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with what-ifs. Bill's mind raced through every decision he'd made since the diagnosis, the threats, the manipulations, the blind hatred. He saw Grace's face, pale and defeated, as security escorted her away. He saw Hope's strength, forged in sorrow. And above all, he saw Liam, the one person who, even in weakness, had always reminded him that love was not conquest but surrender. Midway through the operation, an alarm went off. Liam's heart faltered, his pulse flatlined for 20 agonizing seconds. The room filled with chaos, shouts, and the sound of machines gasping for him. Outside, Bill froze. For that brief eternity, he glimpsed the abyss of his own making. If Liam died now, the last thing his son would have known of him was a father consumed by vengeance, not love. The thought gutted him. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, whispering a plea that was more confession than prayer. "Please, not like this. Don't let me become what he'd hate." When the surgeon finally emerged hours later, exhaustion etched across his face, He managed a small smile.
"He made it," he said.
Hope broke down, tears spilling from relief and disbelief.
Bill didn't speak.
He simply looked through the glass at Liam's motionless form, the ventilator humming softly. The fury that had driven him for weeks dissipated, leaving behind only a deep, aching stillness. In the days that followed, Grace faced her disciplinary hearing. Cameras flashed as she walked into the building, her lab coat traded for a plain suit, her once steady hands trembling. The board stripped her of her license, citing gross negligence.
She didn't argue.
"I did what I had to do," she said quietly, "and I'd do it again if it meant saving him." Her words weren't defiance, they were acceptance. Hope, meanwhile, divided her time between gratitude and grief. She visited Michael, the young volunteer whose donor match had saved Liam's life. He smiled shyly when she thanked him, unaware of the tangled web that had led them there. Bill joined her once, his face somber. "You didn't just save him," Bill told the boy. "You saved me, too." It was the closest he would ever come to admitting how far he had fallen. As Liam recovered, the world outside began to move on. The scandal faded from headlines. Grace vanished from public view, rumored to be working with a medical charity overseas. Bill returned to his company, but found himself different, quieter, slower to anger, haunted by the knowledge of how easily grief can erode humanity. One evening, long after Liam was discharged, Bill stood alone outside the hospital where it had all begun. The sky above was fading into dusk, streaked with gold and ash. He closed his eyes, hearing again the words the surgeon had said that morning. He made it. He realized then that survival, Liam's, Grace's, even his own, wasn't just about the body. It was about crossing the rift between rage and redemption and choosing, at the last possible moment, to step back from the edge. Hope joined him, her hand slipping into his. For the first time in a long while, he didn't pull away. The machines were silent now, the halls empty, the fight over. "We almost lost ourselves," she whispered. Bill nodded, his voice low. "Almost," he said. "But maybe that's how we learn where the line really is." And as the city lights flickered to life below them, he realized that the most terrifying thing wasn't how close he had come to destroying Grace. It was how easily he could have justified it. The thought would haunt him for years, but it would also keep him human. Because in the end, Liam's salvation hadn't come from control or vengeance, but from the mercy of those who dared to tell the truth, even when it cost them everything. And for a man who had once believed power could fix any wound, that truth was both a punishment and a grace he would never forget.
Oh,